Katheon walked out of a building into a vast hall, moving with a smooth grace as he made his way back to his accommodations in this dwarven old city. It was hard to tell underground as he was, but it was nearly dinner, and Katheon had spent the bulk of the day in discussions with local officials, attempting to secure a supply of rare crystal materials for the efforts to prepare farmholds for the upcoming aggressions of Deeplock to their south. Katheon thought about secondary means of securing these necessary materials if his diplomatic efforts here were unsuccessful, and grimaced. The cost would be well beyond anything they could muster, and even if they could, it wasn't clear there was enough on the market for Farmhold's needs, no matter the price. However, if they could establish a trade agreement with one of the interested parties within the Dwarven Empire, they would potentially gain access to the materials they would require at a cost that could be managed and realistically met. The issue, however, was bureaucracy, and as the particular materials Katheon and Farmhold were seeking were considered restricted, and this made necessary a whole slew of regulations and other issues that had to be attended to. Katheon also suspected that the fact that he was less than a quarter century old, and only the lord of some city-state in the lawless lands, had much to do with the voluminous degree of paperwork being put before him. He had been here and working his way through this necessary paperwork and the accompanying talks for almost a week now. And while he was making progress, better than many of the ministers and administrative staff seemed to have expected, time was not something that Katheon had in abundance. Deeplock would most likely attack soon after the snows melt in the coming spring, and that only gave them a few months to have everything prepared. He could, at most, commit a month to these talks before he would have to move on to the other preparations that needed to be attended to. Right now, his brothers were currently dealing with matters in Dragwa Home City, hoping to recruit some of their kindred to Farmhold's aid. Materials and parts were beginning to come in from Nomad's Forge, and that alone allowed for the basics of their strategy to begin to be put into place. The Celestians were working around the clock, along with the citizens, to complete the various structures and other defenses that would be needed to deal with the nearly 250,000 strong force they were expecting to be brought to bear on their city. Being outnumbered anywhere from 10 or more to 1, their entire plan was going to be based on using Farmhold's advantages to their greatest, bleeding the attackers with long-range bombardments and skirmishing forces before bringing them to a final defeat at the walls of the city. For their plans to work, however, they needed these crystal materials from the Dwarven Masters. Without them, the entire plan of battle would have to be redrawn, and it was not clear another workable solution would even able to be formulated. As he continued to head for his quarters, he contemplated whether he should try to grease things along via coin. The ministers he had met with so far had not been shy to the option, but had kept clear of direct solicitation. However, Katheon knew full well that it was likely a test of his character as a path to ease his way along the paperwork. No, he would not take that risk, and he wouldn't allow those he was responsible for to come to harm because he was impatient. Nor would he really trust any agreement that came of such means. He was building with the future beyond this threat in mind, and tainting his and Farmhold's name in a rush now could bring trouble for years to come. Feeling a breeze on his face from nowhere, Katheon was pulled from his thoughts to realize that he had gotten lost and did not recognize the area he was now in. As his hair was softly waving in the breeze, which was odd enough, Katheon checked the internal memory of his armor. While it could easily recount the exact number of steps and the relative direction of them, it could not currently triangulate his current location. As if by instinct, he turned into the soft breeze and chose to seek out its source. A few minutes later, he found himself on a wide observation platform of some kind, overlooking a vast forest in a deep valley between an outer ring of mountains with a massive singular peak at its center. Katheon was in stunned silence as he saw the air practically pulsing with energy, as streaks of color were seemed to condense from nothing and then fly towards the forest. Eventually, a burst of light would flare as it reached whatever its target was. The colors were beyond count, and as they fell from the air like sheets of rain in a monsoon, his armor began to report findings of the various sensors that were active in even this sleeker, non-combat form, and Katheon began to understand where he had found himself, and just a bit of what was at work here. This place acted as a gigantic energy sink in the world's greater metaphysical energy system. There were undoubtedly uncountable numbers of dwarven crystal fields here, each attuned to a different form or type of energy. And as these grew by condensing their form from the energy into a physical form, this large an area with drawing on so many different kinds of energy would create a vacuum, which would eventually be filled in from the entire planet. All ambient and non-linked power would be drawn here. Katheon frowned. The process couldn't be perfect, however, and therefore there had to be some method of returning the uncaptured energy back to the world. Beginning to look with more focus, manifesting the shoulder-mounted advanced sensors of his suit, he began trying to trace the flows and ebbs of power and energy that washed the valley and the forest below, mostly in the forms of colored fogs of various shades and luminosity. Soon he was lost in the way the flows moved and acted, finding it impossible to confirm where all the power was going, other than, of course, the thousands of crystalline formations that sprung from nearly any surface. The bark of trees, the corners of vines, even the very ground. However it was being done, it was clear to Katheon that this was meant for far more than just optimized growth areas for the wonders of dwarven crystal craft, even if that's how it functioned. This had to be an artifact of the oldest era of the realms, and if he was looking at it, that could only mean one thing. Someone wanted to talk to him. Before he was able to finish his thought, the sound of someone coming to a stop behind him heavily snapped him back to the present. After a long second, a voice, low, gruff, but with a hint of amusement, spoke, and asked Katheon if he had figured out what it was for. Tradition among the dwarves of an elder quizzing a younger dictated that he not turn around, but rather answer the question, to prove he was worthy of the elder's company. And Katheon began to think on the matter, and soon blurted out the first thing that made sense to him, that being, It was designed to pull apart complex energies into simpler parts. And while it certainly could absorb and convert even complex energy types into crystals, the vast number of draws from other simpler types would act as hooks, pulling those complex energies apart. No matter how inefficient the overall process would be in capturing the individual complex energies, it seemed only the most elemental and basic forms of energy were left behind, simple and pure. As he rambled, he saw the conclusion of his thoughts in a flash and made mute with it. The insanity of it. The risk. After a clearing of the elder's throat brought him back to the moment, Katheon stated his conclusion. That this valley, the crystals, the mountains, all of it, was built to contain and filter out all aberrant energies from Jam'mar, particularly that of the Daemon Vanson of ancient times and his infamous corruption. Looking at the valley with a low, long sweep of his head, he finished by concluding the fact that it worked so well, even without that power present any longer, was only a testament to the scale of the threat it had now dealt with. Hearing the elder step forward to stand beside him, Katheon's relief was caught short as he was startled to see feathered wings in his peripheral vision. Before he could say anything, the dwarf began to address Katheon as to the purpose for the crystalline resources he was seeking to be used for. Feathertot, master of all things crystal and innovator of dwarven legend, had concerns when it came to the use of such quantities and size of such rare and specific types of crystals. Small fragments, even in the massive quantities, were not an issue, and were common enough, even for these more restricted types. Such small bits were a common and ubiquitous component in nearly every form of Crystech in one way or the other, from heaters to communication units. And such, they were nearly a universally available resource, barely worthy of notice, even at the quantities Farmhold might be looking for. It was the fact that Farmhold was seeking rather large and thus vastly more potent samples, capable of being used for incredibly destructive ends, that had caught the ancient dwarf's attention. Over the next hour or so, as streaks of energy continued to form and be drawn into the forest, providing bursts of prismatic light, the dwarf of near incomprehensible age, having seen the days before even the wars of feather and scale, and the youth of less than a quarter century, spoke of war and of duty, and of defiance in the face of adversity, and how Katheon intended to use the bounty he sought for those aims. He conjured images of plans and designs into being to allow Feathertot to see that this was not only a strategy resulting from considerable planning, but also exacting design born from the talents of those in his retinue. The dwarf's first critique was of how little room for loss or error Katheon and his people had given themselves, asking if it was a matter of cost or of confidence. To which Katheon replied that it was less the cost than the fact the amounts as displayed were the absolute maximum they felt was reasonably attainable. Their research into the markets had indicated there might not even be enough to fill the needs they had, but they had assumed that there would be a reserve held back for such bursts of demand, so aimed to keep things as streamlined and efficient as they could. Leaning on the railing overlooking the valley as they spoke, Feathertot and Katheon negotiated as well as conversed on seemingly random things. The old dwarf shared tales of the Primus, that great expedition ship, and his time there, and how he left the command of it to a great Oratic master in the years before the end of the Wars of Feather and Scale. However, in another hour of such, it was done, and the terms had been reached between Farmhold and Feathertot's own house and craftsman. Farmhold would not get the raw crystal it was seeking. Instead, they would receive the refined and crafted components that they were ultimately in need of, along with spares. The overall cost would be far less this way, and matters of security were also settled by this arrangement, further easing things along. As an added bonus, access to a healthy quantity of the very necessary various smaller crystals were included. These would be needed for any number of items that were to be built, and were otherwise normally accounted as just normal operating material costs. With the agreement Katheon had just made, they now had a direct and bulk source for these vital parts, and with the amount of Crystech that was in use as part of Farmhold's infrastructure, what would otherwise be a near insignificant amount of savings normally becomes substantial rather quickly at the scales at play when building and maintaining a city as large and advanced as Farmhold. In a decade, these savings will have paid for the entire deal he just signed, so long as Farmhold was able to survive the attention coming its way from Deep Lock. All in all, it was a better deal than he could have ever hoped for, and as they began to conclude their talks, just after sending the paperwork off to be filed and the orders to be filled out, Feathertot made an offhanded comment about how well the suit Katheon wore fit him and seemed to function, even after all those years it had been in storage, and then wished the stunned Katheon good fortune and luck in both his preparations as well as his battles to come. Before Katheon was able to follow up these final farewells being said, he found himself standing back in his suite and merely smiled bemused, knowing that he would likely get another chance to ask in the future. For now, he had to ensure everything went as agreed, and after these arrangements were solidified in the morning, he would head to his next destination. Feathertot had just saved him weeks of time and a small mountain of coin, and if he did not use this to his advantage, Katheon suspected he would not get that chance to ask. Such was the way that old folk tended to measure the young, not in their success, but in how that success is followed up, in both word and deed. If you'd like to contribute to the further exploration and explanation of the realms, please consider leaving a comment, a like, and sharing the video around. I read all the comments and make efforts to reply to each. Thank you for helping to grow the channel, and know I look forward to each and every one of your comments. Other methods of support can be found in the channel's description. Thank you for watching,